Welcome back to Beagle iVision's Internet. Don't forget this is fueled by W.GG. Use code Beagle iVision for 10% off. Here we go. We're gonna get some more knowledge. Douglas Martin is a legend. He's very intelligent. And then we're gonna get inside of this 4-leaf fish packing plant. Roam around the wasteland some more. So let's get some more knowledge.
What the stellar people were endeavoring to do, we're not getting out of this. And by this I mean slavery. Because all forms of government are forms of slavery. It creates a condition of duress in the world, and basically everything at that point is an adverse reaction to duress. So in contract law, any contract signed under duress is null and void, because you're basically being forced against your own will. It's not really it can't be a true statement because you did it in an adverse condition in fear for your life or fear for your safety. So we have to keep that in mind. We don't understand that we're being held in a perpetual condition of duress, and that basically everything that happens under those circumstances is an adverse reaction to duress. At that point, even morality becomes questionable. To be able to define what is self-defense and what is violence at that point becomes questionable. And those two things are distinguishable, and we need to be able to distinguish the one from the other. And the whole point is that if we impose man's law, then we're basically interfering with the natural law. We're impeding it. So it can't really take its course. Eventually it'll correct itself and bring it back into balance. And, probably shake us off the planet like a bad case of fleas. But, we have to understand that it's our responsibility to discover truth and learn to live in harmony with it. If I sound a little preachy on this show, that's okay, because people need to hear it. Anybody that ever believed in the ideas of that coercive government or socialism or any form of government could ever be moral and legitimate are trapped in an ideological mindset known as dialectical materialism. And I talked about that in my second presentation as well, and I didn't say a lot about it, but yeah, it's all based in dialectical materialism, which is the idea that in order for growth to occur, it has to be born out of a struggle. So a lot of what we're doing on this show is endeavoring to show that that is absolutely not true, and how to break out of this condition of dialectical materialism. So part of the problem is that people aren't willing to do it because it's difficult work and it's responsibility, and they got better things to do, like worshiping money all day. So you can't, ultimately we can't serve two masters, God and mammon, both, mammon being money, or government. Can't serve two masters, God and mammon, both, mammon being money or mammon being government. Because those things don't truly serve us as a species. They basically stagnate us and will ultimately lead to extinction. So we have to understand socialism, meaning all forms of government and bureaucracy, are responsible for the fall of every great nation in history, including Egypt. Egypt did revert back to socialism in the solar phase of the mythos, which is the later phase. And I've already stated that we've been in this solar phase of this Egyptian mythos for 100,000 years, and that the pinnacle of its evolution is Christianity in the modern world. But all of the major religions in the modern world are based in Abraham doctrines, and while some of them share tenets from the lunar or assign tenets from the lunar phase and some from the stellar phase, Judaism and Islam, those are still based on Abraham doctrines, which is a solar doctrine. So you could say they're solar forms of this, or they're solar forms of stellar and lunar mythos. That means they've been perverted and corrupted or deteriorated. So we have to keep that in mind. When you're hearing me talking about the stellar mythos, this is why, because this is really the only example of an entire civilization that had understood and embraced these principles, and as a result, they had the most enduring civilization ever seen on Earth. Of course, a lot of people don't know about this. So we have to understand, why is this perplexing our seemingly, why is this perplexing scholars, our supposed best minds, Why? Because a lot of the information that we need to understand it is not readily available in general curriculum. It's esoteric and we have to seek it out, and the rest of it was occulted. So we may even need to go into the secret societies to flesh it out. We don't really have to now because we have the internet, but we're probably not going to have that much longer. So if we haven't already started on that journey, I suggest we get started, because we don't have all the time in the world. And this idea of history repeating itself, those that don't learn the lessons of the past are condemned to repeat it. It's about not learning the lesson. Not that we're trapped in time cycles or cycles of time. That's a fallacy. We're not victims of being trapped in cycles of time. Consciousness. Time is an illusion, okay? Time is metriced by consciousness and levels of consciousness. But it's not, consciousness rises and falls in the sense that we go to sleep at night and we wake up in the morning and there's a rhythm. But it's us as a species, we can only be in growth or stagnation or de-evolution, which is an act of our sheer will. See, ignorance is an act of sheer will. So we're not trapped by cycles of time. So history only repeats itself when we refuse to learn the lessons from the past. If we're not going to learn from the lessons from the 20th century, then we have no interest in sustaining ourselves as a species, and we will go extinct. So it's our responsibility to really understand why so many were deceived and led to their grave in the 20th century. That's not what I'm here to talk about today, but we will get into that, We will get into the occult influences in the Third Reich and Bolshevism and Soviet Russian communism. And we'll try to flesh out and help explain these terms so people can better understand, because I know that most people do not understand the terms communism and socialism, conservatism, etc. So we're going to be fleshing those terms out as we go forward through this podcast series. But we're working on a limited time budget, so just try to keep moving forward here. The more I try to do this stuff, the more I have a great respect for Mark Passio, because, knowing this stuff and then being able to demonstrate it and articulate it, they're two entirely different things. So I want to suggest to everybody that, if you're afraid of that, or when you're trying to get started with that, just until you put it into the rhetoric phase, you're not really going to have the confidence to articulate, and you're going to forget things that you're trying to say, and it's okay. The idea is you come back later and correct yourself, or, learn from your mistakes, and the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. And I've watched a lot of these.
Yes, and actually, to touch on that topic, I've actually done that before, where I've made a mistake. I've said something that was, it wasn't correct on Crazy Life Stories, the podcast I do with Matt Bennett, and I had to go back and correct myself. Like he said, it's okay. We're going to make mistakes in our explanations sometimes. It happens. We're only human. It's totally okay. But that's the important part. We do have to, correct our mistakes and make sure we're not leading people in the wrong directions.
Coming researchers and journalists, coming into the scene, and I've watched their progress over the years, and it's really incredible to see. But there's very few that are really chopping at the root like I see Mark Passio doing. So I have the greatest respect for that, because I know that takes the most diligence in the research to understand what the solution actually is. A lot of these movements and things like that are easily infiltrated and co-opted because they don't really have the solution in their pocket. So we can't give something that we don't have. So while their intentions may be benevolent, they don't understand that they've already dropped the ball by not understanding the solution, which is natural law, and aligning ourselves with truth. So I'm going to keep going forward here. Go ahead and give us an Albert Churchward quote right here, because this is relative to what we're talking about. This is kind of a long quote, but that's okay. So like I say, the term socialist or socialism, it refers to anybody that believes in coercive government, centralized control, any form of coercive government. And I better finish my point about the hierarchy. Yeah, so the whole idea of the hierarchy is about respect for elders. So when I'm talking about it has to be a hierarchy, it has to be a hierarchy based on respect for elders. Respect is a mirror, you know, it has to be earned, and our elders don't deserve our respect because they've compromised the knowledge, they've compromised their principles in exchange for some petty power trip that they've been on, some God complex they wanted to entertain. And we can understand this. This could happen to anybody, you know, so there's so much I want to say about it. But it's, you know, it's never okay. It's never acceptable. Ignorance is an act of sheer willpower. So we're going to have to do better, people. You know, that's what it comes down to. We're going to have to take ourselves more seriously.
Be better.
If we want truth, we're going to have to labor for it quite as hard as we labor for gold. It's directly related to self-love. You have to love yourself to the point where you see yourself as worthy of truth and mature enough to handle and deal with that truth. So, getting a little bit away from where I wanted to be, but so let's go back here. When I say socialism, I mean all forms of coercive government. So I'm going to read this Albert Churchward quote. If a nation permits a socialist bureaucratic government to be set up at its head at this period of evolution of the human race, there can only be one end. The principle of this kind of government is to augment official power, official members with undue influence or authority, officials who govern by a rigid and arbitrary routine, causing delay, muddle, extravagance, red tape, corruption, and scandalous waste. The people are not given a chance of developing on true human lines, that is to say, the laws of natural evolution of the development of the human race have been stultified. The system of education is to make the individual a unit of the machine of state, and the individual is merely an accessory part. All his best instincts are stifled, only blind obedience and servility being taught. Albert Churchward. What a powerful quote. And I couldn't have said it better myself. So we have to understand that government will operate much like the ego. It wants to remain executor. So the majority of its resources are going to be used to create a facade, a veneer over its true identity. And by that I mean government is the great Satan if there ever was such a thing. So we have to understand that government will only serve to augment its own power and create muddle and red tape and extravagance and scandalous waste to further stultify us as its subjects and keep us servile to it, while it only serves its own interest to augment that power and create the facade that it is something benevolent, when in fact it's something that is totally antithetic to anything that ever could be good. It's not a political lesson, it's a spiritual lesson in the sense that we have to understand our true value as human beings, therefore understand our purpose as human beings. I'm going to give you a Joseph Conrad quote here. The belief in a supernatural source of evil is not necessary. Man is quite capable of every wickedness. Joseph Conrad. That's one of my favorite quotes of all time. You know, I've heard a lot of people say that the devil invented the ego to take the blame away from itself. And it's really quite contrary to that. What the actual fact of the matter is that the ego invented the devil to take the blame away from itself. So it's our responsibility to learn to recognize evil in the world. And that's part of our purpose as a species. If we're not doing that, we're going to suffer as a result of it. If we truly want the things that we say we want, then there's requirements for that. We have to do the things that are required to achieve that, which I would tell you is discovering the laws in nature and aligning ourselves with truth. We used up a lot of time here, so we're not really going to be able to get deep into these barriers of self-realization, but I'm just going to outline them for us and just basically touch on them, and then as we go forward, I'll have to host another show here in the very near future and go ahead and extrapolate a little bit more on these concepts because they're very important. But let's start with ego identification. Ego identification is about when we identify with the roles that we play. I want to explain the idea. In a left brain imbalance, our complex sets up as executor of the being. And contrary to that, in a right brain imbalance, the middle limbic brain, what's been referred to as the mammalian brain, will set up as executor of the being. And these are both forms of animal consciousness. So they're both below our potential as human beings. There's something less than human. Quite frankly, there's something less than animal because we're not filling our role in nature until we access the frontal neocortex and live above these two forms of animal consciousness. So we have to understand what these are and how this triune brain model in correspondence with this left-right brain paradigm is actually directly related to understanding this natural law. Because these are unseen forces and unseen powers and energies that operate in the time-space continuum at an unseen level. So the Egyptians were what you could call conscious cosmonauts who spent thousands of years discovering and understanding and developing methods to discover these hidden laws. And that's, so when I'm talking about the Egyptian mythos, that's really what I'm trying to get down to. But there's a lot to it. And in my view, there's very few people that are qualified to discuss it or explain it or demonstrate it. And I'm not saying that I'm any good at it either. I'm doing the best I can. But I certainly have done the research to a level where I do understand it. And that compels me to do my very best to help teach that to others. So this ego identification is identifying with the roles that we play. I am my job. I am a doctor. I am a cop. I am a politician. I am a school teacher. Or I am a working mother of two. I'm a working single mother. I am an engineer. I'm going to give you a few more examples. I am the color of my skin. I am my ethnicity, These are all forms of ego identification, and they do not represent who we are. These are roles that we play. These are experiences that we have in consciousness in the time-space continuum. This is not who we are. To say who we are is just to say simply, I am. I am all that is, all that will ever be. I am consciousness having an experience in physical body. Simply, I am. We are self, capital S, self. We're all part of the same self. While ego is necessary for us to survive in the physical world, ego is the part of ourselves that allows us to interact with the physical world. It's the part of ourselves that allows us to put food on our fork and put it in our own mouth rather than the person sitting next to us. It's the part of the self that allows us to recognize, a steamroller that's about ready to roll over us and jump out of the way, or a tree limb that's about to fall on our heads and get out of the way. Ultimately it's a tool. We can't allow the tool to set up as the executor of the being. We have to keep the ego in check and learn how to use it when we need the ego, not to let it set up as the executor of the being, because while the ego protects, it separates. So that's the danger in ego and ego identification. There's a lot more to say about it, but like I said, I just wanted to introduce these topics today. Largely the show today was supposed to be about how to identify evil, and obviously it's going to go on into another show. So I'm just going to mention these barriers to self-realization so we can further flesh them out on a future show. Coming up on the end, running out of time here, people. So we said a little bit about ego identification. Let's move on. And anything that I haven't fleshed out yet or have overlooked, we'll try to get it back out on a future show and further flesh out these barriers to self-realization. I feel they're very important, and I feel a lot of people have missed these. Another one was the 5 sense illusion. That's what keeps us trapped in, only identifying with the physical world. It's what gives us this empirical science paradigm that we have in the modern world. In order for something to be objective, there has to be an object. So we can ignore that which we can't detect with our 5 senses, So an example of this is like, infrared light, just because we can't see infrared with our 5 senses, does that mean it does not exist? That frequency does not exist? Or, like a dog whistle? A dog has an extended hearing range beyond ours and can hear a dog whistle where we cannot. Does that mean that the frequency does not exist? No, it does not. It absolutely exists. We just cannot detect it or decode it with the limitations of our 5 sense perception. We have to engage our higher sensory perceptions, what I would call the 6th and 7th senses, which I would say are, memory and clairvoyance. But we're not going to get into that right now. But we're talking about the 5 sense illusion. So if you've never seen the double slit experiment, I think Mark did a great demonstration of that in one of his early podcasts. I think it was number 7. That's very important to understand that double slit experiment, because it really shows you and demonstrates the observer effect and deals with a lot of tough questions in science about seen and unseen forces and distinguish between particles and waves and ultimately understanding the observer effect. So I do recommend you go check out Mark's podcast on podcast 7, and he really elaborates on this stuff. But like I say, I wanted to introduce these subjects here so we can further elaborate on them in future shows. And there's so many things that I wanted to say in this show, I'm just simply not going to have time to say. So let me just finish out touching on these barriers to self-realization, and then I'll wrap up this show. But yeah, the ego protects, but it separates, and self-preservation becomes its highest directive. This is related to the idea of materialism, and this is what keeps us rooted in fear. This attachment to the physical existence, this existential mode of consciousness. We don't want to allow the tool to become the master. I've heard people say that people like to do the things that makes them forget themselves the most. This related to the Carl Jung quote, "Man will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing his own soul." People want to do things that, they prefer to do the things that make them forget themselves the most. So there's a lot we can say about that. And this is related to ego identification, self-preservation becoming the highest directive of the individual. So it's this, this attachment to the ego and this attachment to materialism that keeps us rooted in this ego identification, and definitely related to the left brain imbalance. So let's talk about the left brain prison. As I said, the left brain prison, or when we root ourselves into a left brain imbalance, our complex sets up as the executor of the being. So we're just action and thought without the emotional governing dynamic of the being and the behavior of the being. So want to understand that this left brain prison is what roots us in this materialism. It roots us in empirical science, empiricism, and leads us astray from truth because we only have half of a picture. And then the last one on the list was the institutionalized belief. And I just want to say putting our faith in man, that's the danger of institutionalized belief. We're putting our faith in man and basically adopting the religion of authority, which is man's, authority, and putting that higher than the laws of creation. So that's going to lead us astray from truth, which will lead to suffering, ultimately extinction. So, everybody thinks that all the institutions are corrupted except that theirs, or all the other religions are corrupted except theirs has remained unscathed or uninfiltrated.
That's the truth.
And that's a fallacy. We have to understand that institutions may establish as benevolent, but will ultimately be corrupted for selfish and nefarious reasons, for control. That every institution has been infiltrated by dark occultism and the dark occultists, which are the dark psychologists that own this place, and that they're using hidden knowledge that we don't understand, that's dictating our behavior without our knowledge of it. We don't understand these influences because we've never studied them. We've never understood and learned the natural law that's being usurped by these charlatans, these usurpers. So we have to understand that institutions are a dangerous proposition because it props up the religion of authority, which leaves us at the mercy of men who are fallible. I love Mark's quote, since none are angels, none are fit to rule, or since no men are angels, none are fit to rule. There's no truer statement that I've ever heard spoken. The way I would say it is we can do better. We should know better. But, I love that statement because it's so true and it's powerful. But anyway, okay, well, we're running out of time. I'm really basically out of time, so I did okay, but there's a lot of things that I had prepared that I didn't get to cover, and obviously I've only touched on these barriers to self-realization, but we're going to further flesh these out in the future. I've got a lot more to say about how to recognize evil in the world, so I'm going to do a follow-up on this show and try to further explain these ideas. And just want to say thanks for listening, and hopefully you've received some value from the material presented today. This episode is at its end, so please make sure to keep your eyes out for the next shows as Brandon and Nate go further into mind control. And make sure you watch all these shows in orders, that way you have a better understanding of the rest of the content that is to come. So, new show coming out every Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific time, and every Friday at 12 p.m. Pacific time. Stay tuned for more. Thank you, and keep transcending dogma.
Yeah, I realized while recording this, I probably shouldn't upload the last half of the religion of money, because he started talking about some hot topics that YouTube does not like. So I'll probably not upload that episode, but I highly recommend listen to this podcast on your own time. If you're, unless you're enjoying this, of course, to each his own, but definitely check out that episode. It's so good. Just like this one. I hope you made it this far. And don't forget, W Energy's birthday's coming up. They survived 3 years in the brutal energy drink industry. So be sure to use code BeagleEyeVision. Get yourself 10% off. Get yourself some W. It's so good. And stay tuned and stay golden. We're going to keep pumping out these episodes. So thank you so much.